Starting at number 10, we begin in the Bronze Age palace of Knossos on the island of Crete, around 1500 BC, where the great civilization of the Minoans painted their walls with the most terrifying gymnastics routine ever attempted by a human being. The fresco is famous. Anyone who has flipped through a history book has probably glanced at it. Two pale figures, a darker figure in the middle, and a massive charging bull frozen mid-stride. The pale figure at the front is gripping the bull by the horns. The dark figure in the middle is inverted, both palms flat against the animal's spine, mid-somersault across its back. The pale figure at the rear has already landed and is throwing up her hands like a modern gymnast finishing a floor routine. What the painting does not show is what happens when the leaper misjudges the timing by half a second. The Cretan bull was not a farm animal. Analysis of the bones and DNA at Bronze Age sites points to stock descended from the aurochs, the ancient wild ox of Europe, an animal that stood up to 1.8 meters at the shoulder, weighed roughly a ton, and possessed horns that curved forward in twin scimitars. To grasp those horns while the animal was charging was to place your face 30 centimeters from an instrument specifically evolved to gore predators to death. Modern bull experts and biomechanists who have studied the frescoes have concluded that the vault depicted gripping the horns and using the bull's own upward toss of the head to launch a somersault over its back is at the absolute edge of physical possibility. If it is physically possible at all. Some scholars argue the leapers must have used a different technique, perhaps a sideways vault, because a front vault over the horns would fling the athlete into the horns rather than over them. Either way, one truth stands out from every reconstruction. The Cretan bull leapers were performing an act with a survival window measured in fractions of a second, in front of an audience that had gathered in the great central court of Knossos precisely to see whether they would survive. Small bronze statuettes recovered from Minoan sites, including the beautiful figurine now in the British Museum, show the leaper caught mid-flight arched over the horns like a scorpion's tail. What no artist ever painted is the aftermath. There are no frescoes of what a horn does when it enters a human abdomen. There are no reliefs of what happens when a hoof lands on a face. And there are certainly no monuments listing the names of the young men and women who did not make it back off the bull, because that is the other detail that gets missed. The bull leapers depicted in the frescoes include both men and women. Minoan art follows a convention of painting male skin red and female skin white, and the pale figures on the great fresco are almost certainly young Minoan women. This makes bull leaping potentially the earliest known co-ed extreme sport in human history, performed at the heart of a palace whose corridors were so complex that later Greek myth transformed them into the labyrinth of King Minos, home of the Minotaur, the half-man, half-bull that ate the youth of Athens. The myth might not be a myth at all. The myth might simply be a folk memory of what actually happened in that court. 14 young athletes going in, some of them not walking back out a bull at the center of it, and a civilization that thought this counted as palace entertainment. The Minoans left no readable written record. Their language, called Linear A, remains untranslated to this day. So the names of the leapers are gone. The number of leapers killed each season is gone. Even whether the sport was religious, ritual, aristocratic initiation, coming of age test, or pure spectacle is gone. What survives is the fresco. And in the fresco, one truth is preserved forever. Whoever painted that dark figure in mid-somersault understood something important. The most beautiful moment in any dangerous sport is the moment just before the athlete finds out whether they are going to live. At number 9, we move south, across the Mediterranean, to Old Kingdom Egypt, around the era of the Great Pyramids, where fishermen were doing something on the Nile that would make a modern insurance company faint. Carved into the walls of the tombs at Saqqara, particularly in a beautifully preserved relief from the early 6th dynasty, around 2345 to 2320 BC, there is a scene that at first glance looks like men working on the river. Two long, thin papyrus reed boats face each other on the water. Each boat carries a crew of oarsmen and standing fighters. The fighters are gripping long wooden poles, and they are, unmistakably, using those poles to try to knock each other into the river. This is Fisherman's Jousting, and it is one of the strangest, funniest, and quietly most terrifying sports of the ancient world. The rules, as best they can be reconstructed from the tomb reliefs, were simple. 2. Boat crews approached each other on the water. The poleman at the prow attempted to strike, hook, or lever the opposing poleman off their feet and into the Nile. The oarsman at the rear held the boat steady and drove it forward. The team with the last man standing won. On dry land, this would be roughly the equivalent of a rugby match. On the Nile, it was a death game with fur and teeth, because the joke, if you want to call it a joke, is what was in the water. Egypt's most iconic predators, the Nile crocodile and the hippopotamus, live in exactly the same shallow reed margin stretches of the river where a papyrus jousting boat could actually be maneuvered. The Nile crocodile grows up to 5 meters in length. Its bite force is one of the highest ever measured in a living animal. It is an ambush predator that specializes in pulling large mammals underwater and drowning them. The hippo, which most people picture as a plump comedic animal, is in fact the deadliest large mammal in Africa, responsible for more human deaths per year than lions, buffalo, and elephants combined. A hippo can outrun a human on land and easily overturn a light river craft with a single upward push of its head. And here is the detail. Every ancient Egyptian working on the river knew. Most Egyptians could not swim. Falling off your boat in the middle of the Nile was not merely losing the match. It was potentially being eaten alive in front of your crewmates, who could do nothing about it because they were still fighting the opposing crew. Some scholars have argued that the jousting scenes are not really about violent sport at all. They read the reliefs as symbolic funerary imagery, showing cave priests delivering offerings to the deceased, or as ritualized games rather than genuine combat. Other scholars, including experts on ancient sport, argue exactly the opposite. They point to the intensity of the poses, the specific injuries depicted, and the fact that these scenes appear repeatedly across multiple Old Kingdom tombs spanning the reigns of several pharaohs. Whatever the original meaning, the physical activity depicted is unambiguous. Men on boats, long sticks, attempting to knock each other into a river full of animals that would kill them. And it is worth pausing on how routine this must have been. The tombs at Saqqara are not the tombs of pharaohs. They are the tombs of high officials, nobles, and scribes who wanted their walls decorated with scenes from everyday Egyptian life. Bread being baked, cattle being counted, grain being harvested, and boat crews trying to drown each other on the Nile. Fisherman's Jousting was so ordinary a piece of Old Kingdom life that a well-off official could look at it on his tomb wall and think, yes, that is a scene worth taking with me into the afterlife. The West would eventually rediscover the sport in a much softer form in medieval France as joute nautique, still practiced today in cities like Sète, where padded jousters try to knock each other into calm harbors with no crocodiles waiting underneath. It is fair to say the Egyptian version was slightly more committed. And here is the final detail that makes Fisherman's Jousting so uniquely brutal. Nowhere in any of the reliefs is anyone wearing armor. Nowhere is anyone carrying a knife to cut themselves free of a crocodile's jaws. Nowhere is there a rescue boat. The men are barefoot, bare-chested, and holding nothing but a wooden pole. If you went into the water, you were on your own. And the Nile, ancient Egypt's mother river, life giver of an entire civilization, was waiting. Sliding down to number 8, we cross to the Greek mainland and to the greatest civic festival Athens ever produced, the Great Panathenaea, where the most prestigious event of the entire calendar was a race so lethal it made Olympic chariot racing look tame. It was called the Apobates, from the Greek word meaning the dismounter, and it is one of those ancient sports that sounds insane the moment you describe it. A 4-horse chariot, called a quadriga, is driven at full gallop around the racing course, roughly 700 meters of it. Standing in the chariot beside the driver is an armored athlete wearing a bronze helmet, carrying a heavy hoplite shield, and in some reconstructions equipped with body armor and greaves as well. As the chariot thunders down the course, hooves striking the ground at what modern estimates put it somewhere between 40 and 60 kilometers per hour, the armored man leaps out of the chariot, he hits the ground running, he sprints alongside the vehicle, matching its pace step for step with 15 to 25 kilograms of bronze and wood strapped to his body. Then, without breaking stride, he vaults back on board. And then he does it again and again. Multiple dismounts, multiple remounts at full gallop for the entire length of the course in front of a crowd that included every major citizen of Athens. To modernize, this reads as suicide. To Athenian eyes, it read as the single most beautiful sport human beings could perform. The Apobates was considered so prestigious that its winners commemorated their victories with monuments, statue bases, and dedications erected in the sanctuaries of the city. One such base, dated to around 300 BC, and now displayed in the Acropolis Museum, shows the scene in exquisite carved relief. The 4 horses at full stretch, the charioteer bracing at the reins, the armored athlete in the moment of the leap. The Athenian mythology attached the origin of the sport to the goddess Athena herself, or to the mythical king Erycthonios, said to have been the inventor of the chariot. Some ancient writers claimed the sport preserved the memory of Homeric warfare, an archaic style of combat in which warriors were driven to the battle line by chariot, dismounted to fight on foot, and remounted to retreat. Whether or not that historical origin is real, the ritual meaning is not in doubt. The Athenians thought of the Apobates race as a reenactment of the moment their own goddess had led them into battle against the giants, jumping down from a chariot into war. To win it was to embody the goddess. To win it was also, quite plainly, to have survived one of the most dangerous things a young Greek nobleman could do. Consider the physics for a moment. A 4-horse chariot at full gallop generates a wall of dust and noise. The chariot itself is a light wicker basket on 2 spoked wheels, designed for speed, not stability. The driver is standing, wrapped in reins, gripping a whip. The passenger, encased in bronze from the neck down, is expected to jump out of that vehicle onto ground being torn up by 16 hooves. If the athlete times the leap wrong, he lands under the wheels. If his sandals slip on the loose earth, he falls under the chariot behind him. If he cannot match the pace of the horses, he is left in the dust, and his remount fails. If his shield strap breaks mid-leap, his balance shifts and he goes down. Athens was small. Athens knew its noble families. And every family that put a son forward for the Apobates race knew there was a genuine chance of receiving him back on a stretcher. That is precisely why the sport was so prestigious. It was, in the Athenian imagination, the closest a peacetime citizen could come to the honor of dying on a battlefield. The Apobates never became an Olympic event. It remained peculiar to the Panathenaea, jealously guarded by Athens as one of the 2 unique competitions that set their festival apart from every other Greek game. And when the Roman Empire absorbed Greece and the great festival slowly decayed, the Apobates decayed with them. There is no modern equivalent. Nobody, anywhere in the world today, has stood in armor on the deck of a chariot going 50 kilometers per hour and jumped off it. The last people to do so are 2,300 years dead, and they did it in front of the city that considered them, quite literally, the most beautiful things Athens had produced that year. At number 7, we travel just a few days' journey west and back in time to Nemea, one of the 4 great Pan-Hellenic sanctuaries of Greek athletic competition, for a boxing final in around $400 billion C that ends with a man's intestines on the sand. Greek boxing was already, by ancient standards, an appalling sport. There were no rounds, there were no timed periods, there were no weight classes, there were no points, there was no ring, there was only a sanded competition square, 2 men, a summer sun in the sky, and a fight that continued until one boxer either surrendered by raising his index finger or physically could not continue. Fights routinely lasted for hours. Judges could impose what was known as climaxer rule, where 2 evenly matched fighters agreed to stop defending and simply take turns hitting each other unprotected until one of them fell. Gloves were leather thongs called himantes, wrapped around the hands and forearms in careful patterns. Over the centuries, these evolved from soft oxhide strips designed to protect the boxer's own knuckles into vicious pieces of equipment reinforced with sharp leather ridges. Harder than any modern boxing glove, designed to cut. Some later Roman versions incorporated lead or bronze studs. When Homer described boxing in the Iliad, he described teeth flying and blood pouring. That was the sport at its polite end. Now, at Nemean about 400 BC, two men have been fighting all day. Their names, preserved in the pages of the 2nd century AD, traveler Pausanias, are Crugis of Epidamnos and Demoxenos of Syracuse. They have battered each other into a stalemate. Neither will fall, neither will surrender, and the sun is setting. The judges impose the climax rule. Each man will be permitted one undefended blow. Crugis will go first, Demoxenos will go second. Cragis, a proper Greek boxer, strikes Demoxenos square in the head with a boxing fist. It is a legitimate blow, aimed at the legitimate target, the skull. Demoxenos rocks on his feet but stays upright. Now it is his turn. Demoxenos does not close his fist. He extends his fingers straight and rigid, and he drives them, points first, into the flesh just beneath Cragis' ribcage. His fingers punch through the skin and into the abdominal cavity. He grips whatever he finds inside, tightens his fist, and pulls. Crugis' intestines come out with the hand. Crugis drops. He is dead before he hits the ground. The crowd, one imagines, does not know how to respond. This is boxing. Boxing does not do this. The head is the rule that everyone knows. The judges convene. And now they face a legal problem because Demoxenos has produced a defense. The climax rule, he might argue, does not specify the fist. It specifies one blow. Demoxenos struck one blow. He struck it below the ribcage rather than the head. He killed a man, yes, but killing was not technically against Greek boxing law. Boxers died in Greek matches every year. The judges deliberate, and they deliver a ruling that is one of the most beautiful legal decisions in ancient history. They rule that Demoxenos did not strike one blow. He struck 4, one for each of the fingers he drove into Crugis' body. 4 separate blows in a competition where the rule permitted him only one. Demoxenos is disqualified. And Crugis of Epidamnos, lying dead on the sand of Nemea with his intestines in the dust, is declared the winner of the Nemean boxing championship. His body is crowned. His hometown in what is now modern Albania would later commission a statue of him. Both boxers would be preserved together. 2,200 years later in the great neoclassical marbles of Antonio Canova, now displayed in the Vatican museums. Crugis in the pose of the striking fist, Demoxenos in the pose of the finger jab. Two men frozen forever in the moment, just before one killed the other. And the truly grim epilogue is this. The Crugis versus Demoxenos fight was famous in antiquity not because it was uniquely horrifying. It was famous because it was the classic textbook case of legal ambiguity in Greek boxing. The horror itself was almost routine. A sport whose championship regularly required a jurist to decide on the spot whether a man tearing out another man's guts should be technically classified as one blow or 4. Number 6 takes us to Sparta, the city that Greek writers love to describe as more of a military barracks than a state, and to the sanctuary of the goddess Artemis Orthia, where children were being flogged as an annual civic ceremony. The ritual was called diamastigosis, from the Greek verb meaning to whip harshly. Its origins are archaic and probably prehistoric. Xenophon, writing in the 4th century BC, describes an early version in which Spartan youths tried to steal cheeses piled on the altar of Artemis, while adults with whips attempted to drive them back. It reads at first almost as a schoolyard game, a competition of nerve and stealth and endurance. But Xenophon was writing about the classical version, the initiation ritual embedded in the Agoge, the notorious Spartan educational program that turned boys into soldiers. What later observers describe is much darker. Plutarch, Cicero, and Pausanias, writing between the 1st century BC and the 2nd century AD, recurred the ritual as it had evolved by the late Hellenistic and Roman periods. The Spartan boys, now called epheboi, were flogged at the altar of the goddess, and the winner of the contest was not whoever grabbed the most cheese. The winner was whoever endured the longest under the whips without crying out. Cicero, who visited Sparta around 78 billion C, and recorded his impressions in the Tusculan disputations, describes Spartan boys being scourged at the altar until the blood ran, and he insists that not one of them was ever heard to cry out or even to groan. Silence under torture was the point. Silence was the mark of the Spartan man. And silence was won by boys, some as young as 12 or 13, holding out longer than their bodies could tolerate. Some of them did not survive. Ancient sources are explicit that competitors sometimes died at the altar, still refusing to cry out. Plutarch tells the story of one boy who was said to have died still holding a live fox concealed under his cloak because he was more afraid of the shame of being caught than of the fox tearing out his intestines. That is the culture we are dealing with. But the truly obscene chapter of Diamastagosis was still to come. Under the Roman Empire, Sparta, which had ceased to be a serious military power, transformed itself into something like an ancient theme park. Wealthy Romans took the grand tour of the Greek world, and one of the featured stops was Sparta, where you could see for yourself the famous customs that Greek writers had been describing for centuries. The Spartans, having lost their empire, discovered they still had a tourism product. In the 3rd century AD, the Romans built a stone amphitheater around the altar of Artemis Orthia. A theater, a permanent, tiered, spectator seating amphitheater constructed specifically to accommodate the paying crowds who wanted to watch children be flogged at the altar as part of their Grecian holiday itinerary. The 4th century orator Libanius records that the spectacle was still drawing visitors as late as his own lifetime, well into the era when Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire. Roman citizens brought up on the arena continued to visit Sparta to watch teenagers be whipped, possibly to death, in front of a wooden statue of a goddess whose worship dated back over 1,000 years. There is a photograph you can find online of the excavated ruins of the sanctuary today. The altar stone is still there. The curve of the Roman amphitheater is still visible. You can walk around it in the modern city of Sparta and stand on the ground where paying Roman audiences ate snacks and applauded while Spartan boys tried to hold their tongue as the leather cut them apart. Ritual, endurance, and civic pride at the beginning, heritage entertainment for foreign tourists at the end. Diamastagosis is the sport on this list that stopped being a sport and became something worse. It became history's first documented atrocity theme park. Now we reach number 5, and we return to Olympia in 564 BC for the Pankration final at the 54th Olympiad, and for the single strangest championship in the entire history of ancient athletics. Pankration was the third and most notorious of the Greek combat sports, alongside boxing and wrestling. Its name means roughly all strength or total power. Everything was legal except biting and eye gouging, and even those rules were relaxed at Sparta, where biting and eye gouging were considered techniques rather than fouls. Fighters could punch, kick, throw, strangle, break bones, dislocate joints, twist limbs, and stomp on prone opponents. The Greeks believed the sport had been invented by Theseus during his combat with the Minotaur in the Labyrinth, which tells you what they thought the standard of behavior was supposed to be. There were no rounds, no time limit, no points, and no weight classes, all borrowed from boxing. Matches ended in one of 3 ways: knockout, submission, or death. The defending Olympic champion at Olympia in 564 BC was a pancratiast named Aricion of Phagalia. Aricion had already won the Pankration crown at the 52nd and 53rd Olympiads in 572 and 568 BC. Now, 4 years later, he was going for his 3rd consecutive title. He was, by ancient standards, elderly. He had already been at the top of the sport for 8 years. The name of his opponent in the final has not survived. Whoever he was extraordinarily good, and by the middle of the fight, he had done something no pancratiast had ever managed to Aricion before. He had climbed onto Aricion's back, wrapped his legs around Aricion's waist, and locked his forearm around Aricion's throat in a rear naked strangle. Aricion could not breathe. Every ancient account agrees on what happens next. Aricion's coach, standing at the edge of the sanded circle, shouts to his fighter. The exact words vary, in the different sources, but the meaning is preserved. Something like, "What a noble epitaph you will have if you are never defeated at Olympia." The message is unambiguous. Do not submit. Die winning. Arician. Choking, listens. He does not tap. Instead, still locked in the choke, he twists his body sideways, hooks a leg around his opponent's ankle, and levers with everything he has left. There is a crack. The opponent's ankle dislocates so violently that the pain overrides everything. In the same instant that Arician feels the ankle give way, the opponent on his back raises his index finger, the ancient Greek sign for submission. He surrenders. The referee begins to lift the winner's hand, but when they turn to Arician, he does not stand. Somewhere in the last few seconds of the fight, either the choke or a broken neck from the twist has killed him. The most famous pancratiast in Greek history is dead on the ground. The judges convene. They face the same kind of ruling problem that would arise a century and a half later at Nemean. The rules of pankration were absolute. Whoever submits first loses. The unnamed opponent submitted first. Therefore, according to the technical rules of the sport, the unnamed opponent lost. It does not matter that his opponent was already dying. It does not matter that the submission came in the same heartbeat as the death. The rule is the rule. The judges declare Arician of Phagalia the winner of the pankration at the 54th Olympiad. They place the olive wreath, the kotinos, on the head of a corpse. His body is carried back to Phagalia, where the citizens erect an archaic stone statue of him in the marketplace, feet together, arms at his sides, in the stiff, early style. The statue is one of the oldest dated Olympic victor statues in the entire Greek world. It survives, in poor condition, in modern collections. Pausanias saw it in the 2nd century AD and recorded its inscription. Arician had done what his coach had promised. He had earned a noble epitaph. He had never been defeated at Olympia. It just cost him his life. And for the next 700 years, until the ancient Olympics were finally shut down by the Christian emperor Theodosius I, around 393 AD, every young Greek boy taking up the sport of pankration was told the story. Every trainer used it. Every fighter walked out into the sanded circle, knowing that the greatest of them all had won by dying. That was the ideal. That was what a pancratiast was supposed to aspire to. And that is why the sport is on this list. At number 4, we cross the Atlantic to the great Mesoamerican civilizations, to the Olmec and the Maya and the Aztec, and to a sport so ancient it predates the pyramids of Giza, and so brutal it might have ended with a losing team's captain having his head cut off on the court, where he had just been playing. The Mesoamerican ball game, called Alamalitzli by the Aztec and Pits by the classic Maya, is one of the oldest organized sports in human history. Rubber balls have been found at Olmec sites dating to around 1600 BC. The game was still being played when the Spanish arrived in the early 16th century AD. That is over 3,000 years of continuous play. To put that in perspective, the ancient Olympics ran for around 1,200 years and were considered ancient by their own final century. Over 1,500 ball courts have been discovered across Mesoamerica. Some cities, like Cantona in central Mexico, had over 20 courts operating simultaneously. El Tajín, in the state of Veracruz, has 17. The Great Court at Chichen Itza is 96.5 meters long and 30 meters wide, the largest ball court ever built. The physical game itself would have been brutal without any human sacrifice attached to it. The ball was solid rubber, roughly the size of a modern basketball, weighing anywhere between 2 and 4 kilograms, depending on the region and period, though some accounts describe balls of up to 6 or 7 kilograms. Players struck the ball primarily with the hip, thigh, or forearm. Hands and feet were forbidden in most versions. Players wore heavy leather or wooden yokes around the waist for hip protection, along with knee pads, elbow pads, and sometimes a stone or wooden hacha or palma to help redirect the ball. Even with the armor, the ball killed players. The 16th century Dominican friar Diego Duran, one of the earliest European chroniclers to describe the surviving Aztec version, wrote that some players were struck so hard on the buttocks or the hip that the flesh had to be cut open to release the trapped blood, and that some died from the internal injuries, broken ribs, ruptured organs, and shattered wrists were routine. Now consider the objective. In the famous ring goal version played at Chichen Itza, and some other later sites, players had to knock the 4-kilogram ball using only hip and thigh through a vertical stone ring set roughly 6 meters up on the sloped side wall of the court. A single ring goal ended the game instantly, and there is a story recorded in some sources that a player who scored 1 was entitled to strip the clothes and jewelry off any spectator he could catch, which suggests scoring was so rare that when it happened the crowd got up and ran. But even the ordinary physical game was only half the story. The other half is carved into the walls of the courts themselves. At El Tajin, the great southball court, is covered in reliefs showing a ceremonial game in which one player at the climax is decapitated. Beside the decapitated body, in the same panel sits an image of a death god, watching, eager, waiting. At Chichen Itza, the walls of the great ball court bear the most famous of all these images. A player kneels, his opponent stands over him with an obsidian blade. In the next moment of the sequence, the kneeling player's head is gone, and from the stump of his neck, 7 serpents spring upward, twisting into the sky. In Maya religious symbolism, blood was sometimes depicted as serpents. And beside the ball court at Chichen Itza, only a few dozen meters away, stands the Tsompantli, the great skull rack where the actual skulls of sacrificial victims were mounted on wooden posts as a permanent public display. Scholars still argue about who exactly was being decapitated. Some think it was the losing team's captain, some think it was the winning captain, sacrificed as an honor. Some think most games were not sacrificial at all, and the ritual killings were reserved for a special class of match played by war captives, who had been forced onto the court specifically to be killed at the end. The Maya kingdom staged ball games specifically to humiliate captured enemy nobles before their execution. The Popol Vuh, the great creation myth of the Quiche Maya, is built around a ball game between the hero twins and the lords of the underworld, in which the losers are executed. In that mythology, the ball itself is sometimes said to be a severed head kept in play as a symbol of the eternal contest between life and death. Whatever the precise mechanics, the reliefs are unambiguous. The Mesoamerican ball game, at its most sacred, was a scripted ritual whose final whistle was a blade. A player walked onto the court, knowing he might not walk off. His performance would be judged not by the crowd, not by the referees, but by priests who had already decided the outcome. And when the game ended, and the priest stepped forward with the obsidian knife, the last thing the player saw was the same stone court he had been playing on, tilted sideways as his head hit the sand. We are now at number 3, and we return to Rome, but not to the arena, and not to the gladiators. We are going to the Circus Maximus, the great stone stadium at the heart of the imperial capital, where an audience of up to 250,000 Romans, more than modern Wembley and the Rose Bowl combined, packed themselves into the tiered stone seats to watch a sport that killed its stars faster than any Roman blood sport ever devised. Chariot racing was the biggest game in Rome. It was bigger than the arena, it was bigger than the theater, it was bigger than the gladiatorial spectacle you probably have in your mind right now. Gladiators fought a handful of times a year. Chariot races were held on more than 100 days of the Roman calendar. Rome was, as a city, obsessed. Every citizen supported a faction. There were 4 of them: the Reds, the Rosati, the Whites, the Albati, the Blues, the Veneti, and the Greens, the Prasini. Fans of the factions were called factionarii. They wore their team's colors, brawled with rival supporters in the streets, wrote graffiti about their favorite drivers on the walls of Pompeii, and treated their charioteers like modern Formula One drivers with better costumes. The starting field was 12 chariots, 3 per faction, and each race was 7 laps around the great central spine, or spina, of the circus. Charioteers wore short leather tunics, leather helmets, and body straps. Crucially, they wrapped the reins of their 4 horses around their own torsos so that they could steer with the shifting weight of their body rather than only their arms. It made them faster. It also meant that if the chariot crashed, they were tied to the wreck. Every driver carried a curved knife, called a falx, at his belt specifically to cut himself free from the reins in the event of a naufragium, which is the specific Latin word the Romans coined for a chariot crash. Naufragium literally means shipwreck. The Romans borrowed the vocabulary of maritime disaster for what happened on the sand of the Circus, because that was the closest thing they could compare it to. A wall of wooden chariots and 16 to 48 galloping horses collapsing into each other at 60 kilometers per hour. The wooden bodies shattering, the horses screaming, the reins tangling, and any driver who could not get his knife free in the first 3 seconds being dragged around the 7 laps of the course by his own team, alive if he was unlucky. This is the sport that killed Flavius Scorpus. Scorpus is a name almost no one remembers today, but in Rome in the late 1st century AD, he was the most famous man in the empire under the emperor. He raced for the Greens. He was born in Hispania, in what is now Spain, probably as a slave, and he was so extraordinary a driver that he was pulled into the imperial training stables under the Emperor Domitian and made a star by his mid-20s. Over the course of a career that lasted roughly 10 years, Scorpus won 2,048 races. To understand what that number means, you have to understand that each race was a lottery of death, and to win one, you had to survive it. Scorpus survived it 2,048 times. The Roman poet Martial wrote epigrams about him. The crowds threw bags of gold coins into his chariot after his victories. Martial records that at one point Scorpus carried off 15 bags of gold in a single hour of racing. And then, one afternoon at the circus, around 95 AD, his chariot crashed. Scorpus went under the wheels. He was 26 years old, possibly 27. Martial wrote his epitaph, and it is one of the most beautiful lines of Latin verse ever composed about a sportsman. In it, Martial has Scorpus speak from beyond the grave. He calls himself the glory of the roaring circus, the object of Rome's cheers and her short-lived darling. And he says that the goddess of fate, counting not his years, but the number of his victories, judged him to be an old man. That was the standard career arc for a Roman charioteer. Winning meant dying young. And Scorpus was not even the winningest driver in the sport. Another charioteer of the same era, Pompeius Musclosus, won 3,559 races and is also dead in his 20s. Fuscus, another famous driver, won 53 major races and died at 24 without ever buying his freedom. Crescens, another, died at 22 having raced since he was 13. And then, against all of this, there is the exception. Gaius Apuleius Diocles, from Lusitania, in what is now Portugal, began racing in 122 AD at the age of 18. He raced for the Whites, then the Greens, then the Reds, and he retired at the age of 42, healthy, alive, and staggeringly rich. He had entered 4,257 races. He had won 1,462 of them. He had placed in over 1,000 more, and the inscription his admirers erected in Rome in 146 amps records that he retired with career earnings of 35,863,120 sesterces, a sum that Peter Struck of the University of Pennsylvania has calculated, in modern purchasing power terms, at roughly $15 billion US. Diocles is, by some serious calculations, the highest paid athlete in the history of the human species. His fortune could have fed the entire city of Rome with grain for a year. It could have paid the salaries of the Roman army at its imperial peak for a fifth of a year. It made the largest provincial governor's salary look like pocket change. And the price of collecting the Diocles payout was that almost nobody else ever lived to collect it. For every Diocles who retired at 42, there were dozens of Scorpuses buried at 26 with a bag of gold clutched in a lifeless hand. Roman chariot racing was, by hard statistical measures, the deadliest professional job in the entertainment industry of the ancient world. It killed more of its stars faster than gladiatorial combat ever did. And Rome adored every second of it. At number 2, we stay with Roman spectacle, but we scale it up to a level of insanity that even the emperors themselves seem to have struggled to justify afterwards. We are going to the Naumachia The great artificial naval battles that Rome staged for public entertainment at industrial scale using thousands of condemned men as involuntary sailors. Julius Caesar was the first to stage a naumachia in Rome in 46 BC as part of his quadruple triumph. He excavated an artificial basin in the campus marshes, filled it with water, and had two fleets, styled as Egyptian and Tyrian, fight a real battle in front of the Roman public. Augustus went bigger. Into BC. He dedicated the great artificial basin known as the Naumachia Augusti, over 500 meters long and 350 meters wide, in which 30 warships and 3,000 fighters staged a recreation of the Battle of Salamis. But the Naumachia that shocked even the Roman historians was the one staged by the Emperor Claudius in 52 AD on Lake Fucinus in central Italy, about 80 kilometers east of Rome. Fucinus was the largest inland lake in Italy, an 11-mile-long crater lake in the Apennine Mountains. Claudius had ordered a massive engineering project. A tunnel almost 5 kilometers long was carved through solid mountain rock to drain part of the lake for agriculture. 30,000 men worked on the tunnel for 11 years. To celebrate its completion, Claudius announced that he would stage the largest naval battle in Roman entertainment history, using the last body of open water before the lake was partially drained. The scale was staggering. Two fleets, styled as Rhodian and Sicilian, would fight in the open water. Each fleet consisted of, depending on which ancient source you read, either 12 or 24 or even 50 triremes and quadremes, all fully rigged, all fully manned. The rowers and marines and fighters, all condemned criminals, numbered around 19,000 men. Around the lake, on temporary rafts, Claudius stationed the elite of the Praetorian Guard, both infantry and cavalry, equipped with catapults and ballistae, protected by wooden ramparts. The Praetorians were there specifically because Claudius knew that 19,000 armed condemned men might well decide to storm the shore rather than fight each other. The rafts and the artillery ensured that if the fleet mutinied, the mutineers would be pulverized before they reached dry land. It was, in effect, a floating extermination camp with a naval theme. The battle began with theatrical spectacle. Suetonius records that a mechanical silver triton, a mythological sea creature, rose from the depths of the lake, blew a horn, and signaled the fleets to engage. Just before it did, the condemned crews, arrayed in their war paint on the decks of their triremes, are said to have called out to the emperor, watching from the shore. Their cry has been preserved by three different Roman historians, Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus. Suetonius records it in the most detail. The condemned men shouted, Ave Imperator, morituri te salutant. Hail Emperor, those who are about to die salute you. This is the origin of the most famous quote in all of Roman gladiatorial mythology. Every movie about ancient Rome, every video game, every cartoon parody of Gladiators has some version of this line. Almost none of them get it right. Because here is the truth that historians have painfully worked out. This line was almost certainly never spoken by ordinary gladiators. There is no evidence in any surviving Roman text that this phrase was a standard gladiatorial salute at all. It appears in exactly one attested historical context, the Fucine Lake Naumachia of 52 AD. It was the plea, most probably improvised, of desperate condemned criminals staring across the water and an emperor who was about to have them slaughtered. And Claudius, in the moment, is said to have replied to their salute with the Latin phrase aut non, which means roughly or not. It was possibly a joke. It was possibly an accidental verbal reflex, whatever Claudius intended. The condemned men interpreted aut non as an imperial pardon. If those who are about to die salute you, the emperor has answered, or not. They stopped preparing for battle. They refused to fight. The greatest naval spectacle in Roman history froze in the water, while 19,000 men waited for the emperor to clarify. Suetonius reports that Claudius, realizing his throwaway remark, had accidentally canceled the battle, panicked. He leaped from his imperial seat, ran along the edge of the lake, screaming and gesticulating and threatening. He is said to have vacillated obscenely a Roman polite phrase for pacing around in an undignified way while shouting. He alternated between promising the condemned they would be massacred by fire and sword if they refused to fight, and then begging them to fight for the honor of Rome. Eventually, whether by threat or by exhaustion, the battle began. The two fleets rammed each other in the shallow waters of Lake Fucinus. Wooden hulls splintered. Men were pulled underwater and drowned in their armor. The Praetorian ballistae on the shore rafts opened fire on any ship that tried to break out of the combat zone. Blood, Tacitus tells us, spread across the surface of the lake in visible clouds. By the end of the day, most of the 19,000 condemned men were dead, and the survivors, who had fought well, were said to have been granted mercy. Claudius, apparently satisfied, went home. The lake was drained not long afterward, and the tunnel was opened, though it never quite worked as an irrigation project. But the phrase spoken that day, Ave imperator morituri te salutant, would echo down the centuries. It would be borrowed by novelists, playwrights, filmmakers, and video game designers who assumed that Roman gladiators must always have said something like this. In reality, it was said once, on a lake, by 19,000 men who were about to be shot with catapults if they didn't drown each other first. A sea war staged in a mountain crater as an afternoon program. Which brings us at last to number 1 and to the single deadliest event ever recorded in the history of professional sport, in any era, in any culture, on any continent. This is not a metaphor. This is not a rhetorical flourish. This is a hard historical fact. On a single day in January, 532 AD, the sports fans of one of the greatest cities in the ancient world killed 30,000 people. It happened in Constantinople, the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, in the reign of the Emperor Justinian I. The event has come down to us as the Nika riots, and it is the story of how chariot racing fandom nearly toppled a civilization. Constantinople in 532 AD was the largest, richest city in the Mediterranean world. 500,000 people. A great hippodrome, or racing stadium, seating 100,000 spectators immediately adjacent to the imperial palace. The old Roman four-color system had contracted. The reds had merged with the greens, the whites had merged with the blues. There were now only two great racing factions, the blues and the greens, and both of them had evolved into something more than sports clubs. They were political parties, religious movements, street gangs, informal militias, and civic identities. The blues drew their strongest support from the wealthy aristocracy and the theological establishment. The greens drew their strongest support from the merchants, the working classes, and the theological opposition. Modern historians have compared them to a mashup of Premier League football ultras and rival political parties, with a dash of religious sectarianism thrown in for extra volatility. Justinian himself, the emperor, was a lifelong blue partisan. The two factions had been raiding and murdering each other in the streets of Constantinople for years. In January 532, a botched public execution in which two condemned men, one blue and one green, both had their nooses break and both survived, escalated into full-scale riots. Justinian, when petitioned to pardon the survivors, refused to answer clearly. The next day, at the races in the Hippodrome, the crowd turned. And then something happened that had never happened before. The blues and the greens, sworn enemies for a generation, chanted together. Their new unified chant was a single Greek word, Nika, victory. It was the traditional cheer used to spur on a favorite charioteer. But that afternoon it became a political weapon. The crowd flooded out of the Hippodrome and set the city on fire. For 5 days, Constantinople burned. The rioters attacked the imperial palace itself. They burned the Senate. They burned the baths of Zeuxippus. They burned the great church of the Hagia Sophia, the original 4th century basilica that had stood on that site for over 150 years. And on the 5th day, the rioters raised a rival emperor. They dragged a nobleman named Hypatius, a nephew of the previous emperor Anastasius, to the imperial box in the Hippodrome, placed a gold necklace on his head as an improvised crown, and hailed him as the new emperor of the Romans. Justinian inside the palace, was preparing to run. Ships were being loaded at the palace docks to carry the imperial family across the Bosphorus. And then, according to the contemporary historian Procopius, in one of the most famous scenes in all of Byzantine history, the Empress Theodora stood up in the council chamber and refused to leave. Theodora had begun her life as a low-born actress and possibly a prostitute in the theater district of Constantinople. She had married Justinian against imperial custom and made herself co-ruler of the empire. And in the hour when her husband and his generals were preparing to run, she gave a speech that ancient historians would repeat for 1,000 years. She reminded the council that once a person had worn the imperial purple, that person should never take it off. She said that she personally could not bear to live a single day without being addressed as empress, and that if her husband wished to run, ships were ready and the sea was open, but that as for her, she would stay. And then she delivered the line that would enter Byzantine folklore. The imperial purple, she said, makes a fine funeral shroud. Justinian stopped, his generals stopped, and they made their decision. They would not run. They would kill the crowd. That evening, the imperial generals Belisarius and Mundus, both hardened veterans of the Persian frontier, marched 2 divisions of loyal soldiers to the Hippodrome. There were still tens of thousands of ordinary rioters inside celebrating the coronation of their new emperor Hypatius, chanting Nika, drinking, dancing, unaware that the imperial army was closing in. The generals gave the order. Every gate of the Hippodrome was locked from the outside. Inside, in the enclosed stone stadium, the imperial troops began to slaughter the crowd. The soldiers moved through the rows with drawn swords, cutting down men, women, and children indiscriminately. The rioters had nowhere to run. Every exit was sealed. The stone tiers of the Hippodrome became a killing floor. When the massacre ended, the sand of the racecourse was covered in bodies from one end of the arena to the other. Contemporary estimates, recorded by Byzantine chroniclers, put the death toll at 30,000 people in a single afternoon. Some later estimates go higher, up to 35,000. Even the low number would make it by a huge margin the deadliest event ever to occur in an active sporting venue in the history of the human race. Modern soccer disasters have killed hundreds. Modern stampedes have killed thousands. Nothing has ever come close to Nika. And here is the detail that turns the story from a political tragedy into something more disturbing. The trigger for the massacre was not policy. It was not religion. It was not taxation, though all three were contributing factors. The trigger was fandom. It was blues and greens, 2 racing factions uniting long enough to burn a city and dethrone an emperor. It was ordinary Constantinopolitans who at the beginning of the week would have identified themselves primarily by which chariot team they cheered for. It was people who had walked into a stadium to watch horses run and walked out ready to overthrow the state. Justinian and Theodora survived. Hypatius, the reluctant emperor, was executed. The Hippodrome was closed for the mourning period, then reopened because Constantinople could not function without its races. The Hagia Sophia was rebuilt on a monumental scale by Justinian's architects Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, and the great domed basilica they created still stands in modern Istanbul today, one of the greatest surviving buildings of the ancient world. It is, in a sense, the strangest monument on this list. The Hagia Sophia exists in its familiar form because 30,000 sports fans died in a stadium. The old church that had stood there for a century and a half burned in the riot. Everything after that is rebuilding, and that is why the Nika riots are number 1. Not because they were the goriest, not because they were the strangest, not because they were the oldest, but because they are the moment when an ancient sport chariot racing revealed the terrifying truth about spectator entertainment at every scale of history. Sport can kill the athlete, sport can kill the loser, sport can even kill the winner. But when a sport becomes big enough, when the crowd becomes fanatical enough, when the identity of the fan becomes fused with the fate of the team, sport can kill the city itself. If you manage to sit through all 10 of these, you now understand what a lot of modern people never quite grasp. The gladiators of Rome, the men we picture as the ultimate icons of ancient blood sport, were among the safer entertainers of their age. They fought in a regulated, refereed, publicly sponsored profession, with medical staff on standby, extensive training, valuable equipment, and the expectation that most fights would not end in a death because gladiators were expensive investments. Most gladiators, especially by the imperial period, survived their careers. Many were freed, a few became rich. The men and women of this list, the Cretan bull leapers, the jousting fishermen of the Nile, the armored runners of the Apobates, the boxers and pancratiasts of Greece, the flogged children of Sparta, the ball players of Chichen Itza, the charioteers of the Circus Maximus, the condemned sailors of the Naumachii, and the 30,000 dead of Constantinople would have looked at the arena of the Colosseum and laughed at how gentle it was. They would have seen the referees and the trainers and the medics and the emperor sitting in his box and wondered why anyone considered this dangerous. Their sports had no referees. Their sports had no medics. Their sports were built from the ground up around the possibility that the athlete would die on the field and that everyone in the audience would consider that a good day out. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button. It is a small thing, but it tells the algorithm to push this video to more people who love ancient history the way we do. Subscribe to the channel if you have not already, so you never miss the next journey into the strangest, darkest, and most extraordinary stories the ancient world has left behind. Ring the notification bell to be first in line when we drop our next investigation. Drop a comment below and tell us which of these 10 shocked you the most. Was it the Cretan bull leapers vaulting over aurochs' horns 3,500 years ago? Was it the Spartan children being flogged for Roman tourists? Was it the Mesoamerican captain having his head cut off on the court where he had just been playing? Or was it those 30,000 Chariot fans locked inside a stadium and cut down in a single afternoon? Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. Our community reaches across every continent, and every one of you helps keep these lost stories alive. And if you cannot get enough of ancient blood, ritual, and spectacle, stay tuned, because we are already deep in production on our next video, and let us just say this. If you thought these sports were dark, wait until you see what the ancient world did in the name of religion. We will see you in the next one.